Hello, and welcome on behalf of RMC and the Institute of Imaginary Music. I would like to welcome you, Therese, for this online lecture. I'm really looking forward to this, and hopefully we have a little bit of a problem with getting this live on Facebook as well, but I hope we will succeed in that. And yeah, we aim for a little treat of 40 minutes talk or so, and there will be room for questions in the end. So without further ado, I will give the ball to you. Here you are, and welcome, Therese.
Thank you very much, Niels, and thank you all for attending here in cyberspace. I'm really sorry that we could not meet in real life, but that's just the way things are at the moment. So I've been looking forward to discuss some of these issues concerning music without sound on Zoom or in real life. So I hope that that you will what's it called keep some questions for the end and contribute to this discussion. Now I just have to find out how I shared my PowerPoint. I'm sorry about this. So can you all see and hear this presentation? Great. Yes. Again, thank you very much for inviting me to speak in this this very exciting forum. Thank you to RMC and Institute of Imaginary Sound. I really love that that this is actually an institute because it's really something that that is interesting to me and to my PhD project. A bit about me: I am a PhD student at the Aarhus University School of Communication and Culture, Department of Aesthetics and Culture, and I have a background from comparative literature and musicology, also from Aarhus University. My PhD project is entitled, for now, Listening Spaces in Literature, Literary Descriptions of Music as Phenomenological Music Analysis. And in my project, I work with representations of music in 24 contemporary novels. And in that sense, the fictional music in these texts are an imaginary music for the inner ear. Niels Løkkegaard was so kind to invite me because we discussed how I have used his Symphony No. 1, Music for the Inner Ear, in my teaching. So in this talk, I will discuss some of the considerations regarding the imaginary sounds of literature, the music described that exists without any sounds, and how the workings of music in literature can be approached while still appreciated as music. So I will introduce to the course I taught this spring and introduce a theoretical approach to music in literature in the field and in the field in general. And I will center around some of the texts I used in teaching. And then I hope you have a lot of comments and questions in the end. Last semester in the spring, I taught a class called Medial Lab at Aesthetics and Culture with my good colleague Annette Vansø. And in this course, I were to introduce the first theme, and we began with a theme I called The Other, working with the intersections of classical media, text, image, and sound, or literature, visual art, and music. As a consistent object of analysis in this part of the course, we work with David Mitchell's 2004 novel, Cloud Atlas, and the movie adaptation, which I will both return to. In the lecture of text and image, we talked, among other things, about the phenomenon of Eephrasis based on W.J.T. Mitchell's text, Eephrasis and the Other. And mind, this is a different Mitchell. So there are two Mitchells at play. This might seem like a detour in this talk, but it's important to go this way first because ekphrasis is a phenomenon that has been around since antiquity. And in our contemporary literary criticism, it's used to describe, with the W.J.T. Mitchell's definition, the verbal representation of visual representation. Classical examples of ekphrasis can, for instance, be seen in Homer's Iliad, in the descriptions of the shield of Achilles, or in John Keats's poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn. Here I share stanza 2 with you, and I'm not going to read it aloud. It's just to show how an ekphrastic poem can look. And in this stanza, in the entire poem, he describes a work of visual art, the Grecian Urn, with images that suggests a standstill in time. And this stanza, the narrator describes the silent songs of the pipes that are never heard, the lovers that never kiss, but then again, never fade because they are an image. In such a description, according to Mitchell and other theorists of ekphrasis, the image becomes present through the text without ever actually being present. To me, it's the same case with literary descriptions of music. If we return to Mitchell's definition of ekphrasis and move it into the field of text and sound, it could sound like this: the verbal representation of musical representation. And why is that not as easily and broadly recognized as the ekphrasis? I'll bring forward a quite forgotten text, actually, by Rodney Stenning Edgecombe from 1993. He writes that ekphrasis, the verbal representation of artifacts, soon took on a generic identity of its own, but the equally complex task of transposing abstract sounds into words, though attempted in countless works, has not been accorded an institutional form. This is what Edgecombe sets out to do with his ad hoc term MELOPHRASIS, and he defines this as any verbal effort to evoke the experience of externally apprehended music. Today, however, this institutional form has yet to be established, and the phenomenon of music in literature has generally not received that much attention from either musicologists or literary scholars, even though I believe that there is a significant musicality at play. MELOPHRASIS is music only transferred to another medium, that is text. And in the course Medial Lab, we use the MELOPHRASIS term to refer to the same dynamic in word and music, as was the case with ekphrasis in word and image. So even though MELOPHRASIS might not be etymologically perfect, since music is not all about melody, and melody is not all about music, for instance, the term is nevertheless very operational. MELOPHRASIS seemed easy to catch, use, and understand for the students. There is, of course, a large international research network in this interdisciplinary field. It's called Word and Music Studies, founded in 1997, and works parallel to Word and Image Studies. Here, many has tried to define what and how musicality is at play in literature. The founding fathers in the 1990s were scholars such as Stephen Paul Scher, Werner Wolf, Walter Bernhard, Lawrence Kramer, among others. Scher, and Wolf in particular, has worked formally to define the ways in which music can appear in literature. They categorize this broad field into music and literature, that is, music and literature both present through their own media, text and sound, for instance, in a romantic lied. Then there is literature in music, that's music imitating literary qualities, for instance, in program music, and music in literature. And it's this last category that my work and interest centers around. But Wolf has gone even further to break this down into other categories. And it's the same image. I've just zoomed in a bit on the one on the left, so I hope you can see it. In this system, Wolf attempts to cover all cases of music in literature, from the musicality of text and word, to the formal imitation of musical genres and forms, and the descriptions of music, and so on. I know it's a bit complicated, and I don't want to dwell on this system. I just want to use it to show that a lot of opinions exist and a lot of work has been done in this area. So Wolf, among others, has been consistent in pointing to the medial or semiotic impossibility of music in literature. All these quotes suggest some ideas of dominance, for instance, that one medium is dominant to the other, or competence, whether the writer or the reader has the competence to write or read about music, and assessment of when literature is musical and how well it has been done. It's a general approach also to refer to music in literature as being merely a metaphor of music, and Wolf does this extensively as well. So it's on this very top level of the discussion that we might look at it the other way around, not as literature that is musicalized, as Wolf's very title suggests, but as music that is literalized or written. Why do we fear the others? Because aren't music and literature both oral media expanding in time? Newer research in this field is more interested in the cultural aspects of the music-literature relationship, and I have shared some references here if you're interested in further reading. This culturalist approach, instead of the formal and medial considerations, is also where my PhD research is heading. At the same time, this divide between the formalist and the culturalist is a bit blunt and unconstructive. I believe some important fundamental questions in this field could still be discussed in a newer context. For instance, why haven't we agreed on a term describing the phenomenon of music represented in literature? Can we not approach it as actual music just transferred or remediated to text? Because when is music music? Do we need to verify whether literature has represented music well or poorly, or question whether the writer knows what he or she is doing, or whether the reader has the competences to understand? If texts cross disciplinary boundaries, so must we. So moving from text and image to work with text and sound, I compile a compendium with different historical examples of music and literature. It's of course a very limited list. I compiled the list based on the number of study groups, so it can be expanded a lot. And I also see now, as I've listed it this way, a certain gender issue, because I could have included writers such as Virginia Woolf, or I could have included newer writers such as Jennifer Egan, who includes a lot of music in her narratives. But that's the list we work with, so that's the list you get. The first example is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Der Erlkönig, a poem that is set to music by Schubert. And this is a romantic lead, a classic example of music and literature, where both media are present, supporting and enhancing each other. Then we work with George Bernard Shaw, Man and Superman. And this is funny because it's written like a play, but in a style that suggests that it's intended for reading. And in Act 3 of this play, notes from Mozart's opera Don Giovanni appears in the text, supported by descriptions of how that music sounds. And I will return to that in a minute. The next example is Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, the very famous Vinteuil sonata. It's a purely fictional sonata for piano and violin that is a very important part of the narrative. This is one of the more interesting examples, which I would like to highlight in a minute as well. We also work with Hugo Ball's Caravana, a Dada sound poem that's made to be read aloud and heard, like literature and music also have in common. They're both oral media, so here music works at the formal level of the text and the words. And the same is true for Celan's Todesfuge. It's a poem that has been composed as a fugue. And to include some newer text, we work with Knausgård's Min Kamp, eller My Struggle. That's in this novel, the character finds his identity during adolescence through playing music. And there are many wonderful references to playing and listening to popular music in this novel. And I'll return to this as well. And then we had Niels Løkkegaard's Symphony No. 1. That was the most recent example. And it's not in that sense a literary work with a narrative, but it's a literary way of representing music as a medial experiment. The students really liked it and became aware that this is an ongoing discussion. and the music is not necessarily in the form of sound and notes. But they all agreed that this is not a real symphony. On the other hand, is it then a real collection of poems? The question is whether it's music, because when is music real? And I really like this example because it puts forward some important discussions about the potential sound, the inner ear, imaginary music, medial boundaries, and so on. I like to refer to it as the platypus of the field. It's something that breaks down the categories and at the same time contain them all, like the platypus is both fish, bird, and mammal. And then, of course, as mentioned before, we work with David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas. So, to present some of these texts, let's start with Shore. In Act 3, Act 3 is a reinterpretation of the famous Don Juan myth, and there appear notes from Mozart's Don Giovanni opera. The notes are accompanied by MELOPHRASIS that lays out the music to the reader. So before the first image of notes, it says, "Then somewhere the beginning of a pallor, and with it a faint throbbing buzz as of ghostly violoncello palpitating on the same note endlessly. A couple of ghostly violins presently take advantage of this bass." Here the notes are connected to the characters, and this part of the overture connects with the Don Juan character. And further on, notes from Donna Anna's famous aria appears, thus presenting her. And when the statue appears, it's with the description of the statue theme from the opera. "Hush, listen, two great chords rolling on syncopated waves of sound break forth, D minor and its dominant, a sound of dreadful joy to all musicians." So while music can be said to medially refer only to itself, since it consists of signifiers with no signified, in this literary context, music carries suddenly a literary meaning and a referentiality because it is connected to certain characters and certain parts of the narrative. In Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, there appears a sonata for piano and violin. A little phrase in the Andante catches the attention of the character Charles Swann and becomes the theme in his love story with the woman Odette. This music is purely fictional, but is it thereby not real? Because the Vinteuil Sonata is famous and it's obviously written for text. It does not exist in sound, even though many a scholar has chased the real Vinteuil Sonata, the one that inspired Proust to write about it. And throughout the novel, it is described in such details like this. Scarcely had the pianist begun to play when suddenly, after a high note held on through two whole bars, Swann saw it approaching, stealing forth from underneath that resonance, which was prolonged and stretched out over it like a curtain of sound to veil the mystery of its birth, and recognized, secret, whispering, articulate, the airy and fragrant phrase that he had loved. So this is a description of the little phrase. And to really appreciate this as music, I have attempted to gather all the information about the sonata throughout the book and attempted to order it in the musical chronology. I have done this in a recently published article that I have referenced below this quote. And interestingly, the little phrase appears to be only the second theme in the second movement, that is the Andante, played in the piano and not the more high-pitched and foregrounded violin. So it's actually not that dominant in the musical piece as it is to the characters in the narrative. The phrase is, for instance, described like this. It's a phrase, a harmony he knew not which, appears in the mass of the piano part, multiform, coherent, level, and breaking everywhere in melody, like the deep blue tumult of the sea, silvered and charmed into a minor key by the moonlight. And this phrase is characterized by the closeness of intervals between the 5 notes which composed it and the constant repetition of 2 of them. So this sonata, and in particular, the little phrase, is described in detail through colors, smells, metaphors, associations that appears very alive to the reader. It talks to all the senses and allows us to experience it through all these references at once. Also, in this sense, the narrator is important because the narrative frames our experience of the music. The sonata can be read as a classicist sonata form with a main and a second theme, an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation through the ears of Svan. It's a very harmonious composition to his ears. It can, however, also be the narrator's manipulation, because in another paragraph it is described how the music is received by the general public. And it appeared to them, when the pianist played his sonata, as though he was striking haphazard from the piano a medley of notes which bore no relation to the musical forms to which they themselves were accustomed. So mind, this is written in a time of avant-garde and 12-tone compositions, and the reading of MELOPHRASIS have to take into account literary qualities such as the reliability of the narrator. Let's look shortly at the formal level of the text. Celan and Joyce both tried on a formal level to create a musical form of the fugue in literature. Joyce's chapter Sirens in his masterpiece Ulysses from 1922 is not only filled with descriptions of and references to music, it's also, according to Joyce himself, composed as a fugue or a fuga per canonum, whatever that means. It's not a genre distinction I'm familiar with, at least. The same has been done by Celan, but in the form of a poem, and they both face the impossibility of polyphony in literary text. This is what many scholars such as Wolf criticize regarding such adaptations of music in text. But through the splitting of plot lines, repetitions, answers, and rhythms, qualities that literature indeed has, it can create a feeling similar to that of a fugue for the reader. For instance, here from Joyce: bravo, clap, clap, good man, Simon, clappy, clap, clap, encore, clap, clip, clap, clap, sound as a bell, bravo, Simon, clap, 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 encore, and clap, said, cried, and so on. It's very clearly a musicality on the structure of this text. And so again, the question of medial boundaries or competences can seem redundant because in text like this, a musical idea is shared with the reader. In Knausgård's My Struggle, the narrator's band play a disastrous concert in their teenage years. I only had the Danish version of the book, I'm sorry about that, but I've tried to highlight what I wanted you to notice in this paragraph. Because here they are playing the intro to Deep Purple's Smoke on the Water, as any band. And this is told through onomatopoeia. The hi-hat goes chicka chicka and the bass goes bum 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 bum. And then there is the counting. If you know the song, you can hear it play. But everyone who knows a little bit about rhythms music can also see how wrongly he counts. It does not say 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, because the second bar is lifted and offbeat. So this brings something back to literature. If we approach the MELOPHRASIS from a musicological angle, how basic it may seem, it turns out how little the narrator actually knows about music theory. On the other hand, when the narrator likes the music, the descriptions change into much more poetic descriptions of his feelings and bodily reactions. It's obvious that the narrator does not like Smoke on the Water, or Black Magic Woman for that instance, and therefore the music is reduced to plain onomatopoeia, such as chicka chicka, instead of associations, metaphors, feelings, and affects. And so I return to Cloud Atlas. After a few detours, I'm sorry about this major cliffhanger. Cloud Atlas is truly an interesting novel. It's split into 6 narratives set in different times, places, and literary styles. They appear chronologically, but are split halfway through, interrupted by the new narrative. After all 6 stories have been introduced, the novel works backwards in time, thereby finishing the narratives in the opposite order. It is a work that thematizes time, history, and media, but also music. And in one of the narratives, Robert Frobisher, a 1930 composer, writes the piece of music that is described here and called the Cloud Atlas Sextet. Reworking my year's fragments into a sextet for overlapping soloists, piano, clarinet, cello, flute, oboe, violin, each in its own language of key, scale, and color. In the first set, each solo is interrupted by its successor. In the second, each interruption is recontinued in order, revolutionary or gimmicky. Clearly, this musical piece serves as a microcosm for the entire novel, and the MELOPHRASIS describing this fictional sextet is scattered all around the narrative. For instance, Frobisher dreams that he is in a china shop, and from there he gets his first inspiration to the sextet. And here we get some clues about the key, a D major held for 4 beats, an E flat whole string section, divine harmonies in my head, and then he says in the end, I'd become the greatest composer of the century if I could only make this music mine. The interesting thing is then, how has this music, by what he claims to be the greatest composer of all time, or of the century, come into being in the movie? Actually, the composers of the movie made 2 different themes based on the Cloud Atlas Sextet. The one was called the Cloud Atlas Sextet for Orchestra, and the other was a piano piece, the Cloud Atlas Sextet. None of them incorporates the structure nor the instrumentation described in the novel, but even if they did, would it be the same piece of music? Which is the real Cloud Atlas Sextet? And likewise, would the Vinteuil Sonata still be the Vinteuil Sonata if we found its real reference or composed it into sound? As an exercise, the students were told to work the MELOPHRASIS the other way around, to listen to the music written for the movie and describe it in a literary style. Some chose to describe their experience while listening in an essayistic style. Others described the music through metaphors, for instance, standing inside a wave of water without ever mentioning music at all. Others tried formal adaptations of the piece, for instance, repeating sounds or rhythms. Others again worked musicologically, breaking down the structure of the composition, the instruments, and the themes. This exercise was to me really interesting. It showed how very different music can be rendered into literature and how differently we listen to music. It also suggests that creative writing or reading literature can be a democratized way of listening to music without the elitist language that often characterize musicology, and that might frighten some people off when working with music. It also suggests that the aesthetic value of music in literature lies way beyond the question of media. It does not matter in which media a musical idea appears, as long as it speaks to something in the listener, reader, or audience. There's truly something at play when literature repeats music. So to conclude, or perhaps just ask some more qualified questions on this backdrop, is it still the same piece of music if it were attempted composed in the medium of sound? Would not Løkkegaard's Symphony No. 1 become a new symphony if it were written for orchestra? And similarly, when songs like Smoke on the Water is transformed to the amateurist musician in Knausgård, is it then still the same song? Or is it a new literary variant, a rephrasing, or perhaps even a remediation? Does not the notes of Mozart's Don Giovanni change their function and referentiality when used in the literary medium? I believe the descriptions enhance our musical experience and allow us to share music on different platforms and media. And this becomes a democratized way of listening. This is also a question of senses, which senses we use to experience music. And here phenomenologist Gernot Böhme has a point. He writes about synesthesia, the phenomenon where the stimulation of one sense leads to the stimulation of another sense, for instance, from sight to hearing. And he writes that to talk of a soft note is an example of a metaphorical speech. In our conception of music, we are accustomed, primarily owing to the predominance of the piano, to conceiving of all imaginable notes in a row. So musical ideas are always present in the way we talk about music. We imagine how music works, and we use language to describe it. We speak of soft notes, a metaphor, as well as long or short notes, for instance. And in that way, literature and language is an important part of our conception and imagery of music. What I do in my PhD project is actually to take all this for granted. To me, it does not matter if it's a fictional or real music. that is described. What I look at is the listening character. How does the music affect him or her? How is it described? How does that show a general discourse of music in contemporary society? I have chosen 24 novels, 12 thematizing art music and 12 thematizing popular music. And allow me to finish off with a little perspective on genre, since I'm in this privileged forum to ask. Is that an out-of-date genre distinction? Like the division between the formalist and culturalist approaches, the division between sound and text, as well as the division between sight and hearing, they're all a construction. Perhaps this is the same case with musical genres, which I have not considered here. There is a mix of art music and popular music in my text examples. So is musical genre still important? Or is it the same as the question of whether a MELOPHRASIS works on a fictional or real-life reference? I hope to have shown how very differently music can appear in texts, but that there lies a significant musical quality in that. We must approach it as an actual music in a different medium. And this helps to shake our general conceptions and divisions of the art forms and appreciate how and why music matters with or without sound. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your comments on the matter. And please stay in touch if you have anything to share with me. That would be great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Therese, for this very inspiring and thorough and condensed talk with a lot of super interesting references and materials. I don't know if there's some questions among us here. Then feel free to fire away.
You can also write the questions in the chat chat room, or instead of going live if you don't feel like it.
Good point.
Otherwise, Nils, maybe I don't know if you have anything you can start with.
Yeah, I was just like I think for each slide you showed like new thoughts sparked all the time for me. So I'm very curious about this personally. Also, the distinction between literature and music. When is something literature and when is it music? Does the literature need to, like, what if a lot of the stuff we call literature actually is music? It's just like this kind of it's not a question, it's just like something I was thinking about. And then of course, like this it's funny when we read books and read literature. I think for me there's a common consensus that the great thing about that thing, one of the great things, is that it unfolds in this imaginary space where we as a reader make our own kind of imaginary space, whereas music kind of there's a more like a pressure, or like that it should manifest itself in a physical way before it's music, like almost like the same. If the same would apply to literature, it would be like it has to be turned into a movie before it's real or something like that. That like from a composer's point of view, the idea of the score, for instance, then literature could also be looked upon as musical scores in a way which I also think is super interesting. And yeah, these transitions between realities, it's like we have, I think, a little bit of an old-fashioned idea about what is music and what is not music, and music is heavily correlated to the physical manifestation of music anyway. It was not a question, it was just, you just sparked so many ideas. Yeah.
I'm glad that I did so, but I think those are really important considerations because first of all, the idea of the score, that's what I meant by the democratized listening to music,
Yeah.
because then we can approach music from a different angle and in a different language that you don't need a musical education to understand, without
Exactly.
undermining the importance of the score, but they're both a contribution to the discourse of music.
Yeah, exactly. And also this kind of then you realize that this thought about the genius, like we probably know the story about Beethoven, who could like imagine music and then wrote the score, you know, and it was something that is only applies to geniuses. But as you say, what if in fact we all are capable of imagining this music, and if we actually just describe it in another language than the notated language of sound, it opens up for all these numerous different musical experiences, and as you say, in a more democratic sense. I think that is such an important point.
Yeah, because we can help each other open the music, right? I remember when I met my husband, and he and he played me a long piece of guitar solo on his I don't know what record it was, but I found it kind of boring. And then afterwards he said, okay, this is a story being told by the guitarist. Listen to it again. And then I listened in a different way, because people can, you know, enhance each other's listening experiences. So maybe reading a novel about Don Giovanni, for instance, or another piece of music that can be difficult to listen to for modern ears, at least. We can go back to the music and listen in a different way also.
Totally.
And I was thinking about the what you said about the borders of what is literature and what is music, because what I've discussed here is actually also the major problem of Eephrasis theory, because doesn't literature always describe other things? That's the main that's what literature do, right? So why is it different when it describes music, or a poem describes a Grecian urn? Why is that suddenly a different genre?
Yeah, I think that is also so super interesting, like with the alphabet itself, like this kind of explosion going from the dawn of the alphabet, like trying to convey a certain sound into a certain letter, like the A is like A, we imagine A, and we learn to read like A, B, and then we say that sound, and then like this shift from letters becoming words with a meaning that is pointing away from the sound itself, but really back, way back, even the written letter, you could argue that is kind of musical as well, or at least like a way of conveying sound into something that is visual. And then it's like this visuality is like, it's so strong that, yeah, exactly. Then when we then describe sound or music in text, then it suddenly becomes very different, because we're so used to. I was just thinking about also in terms of metaphors, if such a thing like a non-visual metaphor would exist, like an oral metaphor, like it doesn't really exist in our language, and it's hard to imagine. But do you know what I mean?
But doesn't tactile metaphors appear, for instance? That I believe that's Böhmer's argument that a soft note is it's a tactile way of listening to music. But that's the interesting part, that when we speak, there's no boundaries between the senses. There are no boundaries, and so literature might help break down some distinctions. But that's also the main difference between literature and music, because literature does exist of sounds, right? But the sounds are compiled into words, and those words are referential, so they refer to something outside of the text and something that can exist without the context. But in music, a note or a chord or a cadence can only refer to something in itself. And that's what literature can give to music. It can give referentiality. It can give a different way of sensing, you could say.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and then I just think it's so interesting also with the kind of within music. I think the dominant kind of John Cage coined it like this kind of that music is something that has to do with time. So if I frame something and say within this 4-minute time span, this is music, it like that has been like the position. And I think it's so interesting when we deal with this imaginary music or the potential music that even there, like time becomes bendable. So we can the definition of music being like a strict temporal physical thing, that when we imagine something that is 10,000 years, like a sustained note of 10,000 years, for instance, it opens up to a whole like you're also confronted with the limitation of your own imagination, so to speak, and suddenly like also time gets bended in an interesting way, I think, when we write about sounds with words. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
And literature can stage time in a whole different manner, because
exactly.
It can jump in time back and forth, and it's a medium that plays with temporality.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any more questions. I was just like to I can ask you about that later on, but all these references and books, some of them I knew about, some of them I did not know about at all, and I thought it would be super nice just to have all these titles to dive into.
Okay.
So
but can I share the PowerPoint perhaps in
the chat?
Oh yeah, I can.
Yeah, perhaps. I don't know if can we download from the chat. Perhaps you can.
I think so. Yes.
Otherwise, just yeah, and I don't know if I can find out how to do that. Perhaps I can. We can see.
Just a minute.
I also have one, maybe two comments. And
Please.
I hope that they will make sense, because I haven't had anything to eat and just a lot of coffee today. I was just thinking, when you were talking about referentiality, there's an example that is often used with Aboriginals. Their singing refers to very specific, a very, very, very specific context. When they're walking from where they live to the water, if they're going for water, or if they're going hunting, they were singing songs. This is and they are singing about the stuff that they pass, things that they pass, bushes here, trees over there, the place where we hunted down the wild animal over there, the place where we sacrificed. So, and they're singing this song on the way to the water. If they're going somewhere else, they're singing something else. And this, it's more like a comment. It's just a super beautiful example of something that are in between the two things that you're doing, Niels and Therese. I mean, you have text, and it refers to something very specific, and the act of singing it is a performative act in a way. Can you follow what I'm trying, where I'm going?
Absolutely. But in terms of referentiality, that's a cultural referentiality, right? It's something that we have put into music, but semiologically, music has no references, but it can be used in ways that creates references, like the Don Giovanni piece becomes something characterizing in the work of Shaw. But wow, that's really a lovely example. I haven't heard that.
No, it's just it wouldn't make sense as music or as just as text. It only makes sense in the performative act of actually walking the route and singing this song. Yeah,
and it's bound to a geography as well.
Yeah, and I guess it also contains like information. I mean, like, isn't it? I think it's McLuhan who talks about the prior to the written to the alphabet, like he talks about the acoustic, like we lived in an acoustic time where the ear, like man was given an eye for an ear with the invention of the written language, like this prior to language, like also how to convey information, how to storage information would be that of singing perhaps, or yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I actually forgot the other comment while trying to explain.
Sorry.
No.
I talk too much, perhaps.
No, I do.
But can I ask then the question of genre? Is that because I'm here at aesthetics and culture and not musicology or the Conservatory of Music in Copenhagen. So how do one deal with genre today? Is it an out of date distinction like the ones I've tried to show are out of date?
I don't know. What would you say, Jan, or any of what about B056205?
I'm sorry, this is also a broad question. I've just come to think of it, perhaps because I really try in my project to break down these boundaries, but then I still reproduce them because I say, okay, well, I have 12 with 12 novels concerning popular music and 12 novels concerning art music and blah blah. Is it something that one can free oneself from? Perhaps.
I think it's a huge discussion, or not a huge one, but I'm thinking perhaps I think within music it also has something to do with like the power of different institutions and politics and power relations. So even if you want to smooth things out, I think I don't know, it's a tricky one.
It's just because I noticed that you can take a singing education, right, with where you both sing classical and popular music. So it seems like these boundaries are about to be renegotiated at least. But it doesn't sound like it's something a topic of yours.
I know not so. I don't know. What about you, Jan? What would you say?
I have a hard time answering this question, I think.
Yeah. Me too. Yeah.
Okay, then I just continue reproducing boundaries.
Yeah. But I think if there's not any, sorry.
No, I just came to think of another. My other comment was that the way you have written your symphony, Niels, and the way that you talked about that literature has a different way of installing time. I mean, poetry, it could be poetry, but yours is very, Niels, yours is very concrete, that imagine a sound like this, or even in your symphony, right? Now you hear this, and the drums go this, and the violins go woo, but if you wrote it as, instead of like, if you wrote it as poetry, if you really wrote it as poetry, you could install a different time.
Yeah, and that is, I guess that is the thing with this symphony. I really did not want to go into this. I was trying to. I was also in. It's a long story, but I was partly intrigued by the idea of the story about a piece of art becoming a piece of art detached from any like physical manifestation of the piece of art, in this kind of more like how we often it was back in 2016 I started doing that, and then there was a lot of like these programs for festival being online all the time, and I was just thinking it seemed that like that the story about the festivals was more like the piece of art than the actual physical event. So I wanted to also describe this symphony as kind of a social media language, or like a kind of very nocturne. I don't know the English word for that, but kind of very not that. I just wanted to write it a little bit. Perhaps cold, or or just describe it as nocturne as I could. And then I tried in the anthology of sound I made last year. There I really tried to go into this time, how I can wrestle time and the horizon of time, and how I'm interested in another degree in, because I realized also when working with imaginary sound that often when I also ask people or myself to imagine something, then we have a kind of a boring, sometimes a tendency to imagine music that is already there, or music that is clearly possible. And it's like we're even in our fantasy is kind of pragmatic. And then so in the other work, I'm really trying to push the limits for our capacity to imagine stuff, like to revitalize our fantasy, so to speak. So there, I'm not interested in describing music or sounds that are kind of possible to imagine.
But could poetic language change that?
Yeah, perhaps. Perhaps. It's kind of a sidetrack. Sorry.
Not at all. I think it's interesting. What I hear is that you try to write it without a narrator.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. And also, as you say, I was also interested in terms of if in the symphony, there's a lot of these like also terms that are and of course you also deal with this paradox. And on one hand, we want to democratize the act of hearing music, but on the other hand, we exclude, just by writing in a certain language, we exclude so many people. And also by deploying certain descriptions of instruments or musical thermologically stuff, that you also exclude people. So in the symphony, there's a lot of these technical things where I write about pizzicato and the sound of a piano, and even down to the different frequencies, where you really should kind of perhaps know a lot in advance. And when I say the sound of a piano, then I guess we can all listen and imagine something. It's a very concrete, in a way, room, imaginary room. This sound unfolds itself in. But if I say like a deep sound, already there, the imaginary space becomes way wider. And of course, and perhaps it also gets a little bit more difficult to evoke an inner sound, because a deep sound is kind of more fluffy than the sound of a piano. So in this anthology of sound, I'm trying to describe sounds that are that offers a broader imaginary space, where you should work a little bit more to evoke any sonic experience. And also, I think, and that is the thing, like, I don't really think that inner music erupts in this anthology of sound. You more like have experiences about how you are wired almost in the brain. If I were to like describe, you hear two sounds from the front, one from the back, a softer sound from the left, and 10 sounds from underneath, then you are like, it doesn't give you kind of a musical experience, but you get aware of kind of a sonic, a kind of sonic environment where you are bombarded with sounds from different directions within a physical space, described in an imaginary, described in language. So yeah, now I'm drifting, but yeah, I'm interested in to see if I can democratize the act of imagining sounds even more. But then it turned out on the cost of it not being actually music anymore, but more like these sonic plateaus or something. Yeah. So if there's not any further questions, I think we should round this up. Once again, Therese, I think it was super great. It would have been nice to just keep on listening to you, but yeah, thanks for joining us today.